Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Purpose Tune podcast. My name is Kong Shong, and I am the host of this podcast. Of course, the goal of the show is to create valuable content to broaden your knowledge, inspire you to act, and get you in the right mindset so you can apply it in your own life to drive impact, generate meaning, and achieve your purpose. I'm very excited about today's episode's guest. His name is Dr. James O. Rodgers, author, speaker, executive coach, and spiritual teacher. He has practiced and coach business executives in the areas of diversity management as an enterprise performance discipline for over 35 years. He is recognized by his colleagues as one of the leading strategists and the number one thought leader in the field of diversity management. And he is known as the diversity coach. Dr. Rodgers has been a behind-the-scenes advisor to leaders in over 300 major enterprises, including Coca-Cola Company, Georgia Power, BellSouth, which is now AT&T, and not-for-profits, including YMCA of Metro Atlanta, and the High Museum of Art. Internationally, Dr. Rodgers has been a trusted advisor for global brands such as Johnson & Johnson, IBM, and Chevron Texaco. And his work has been quoted on major media outlets like the New York Times, Financial Times of London, and Chicago Tribune, as well as Wall Street Journal. Dr. Rodgers, I guess, James, if I may call you, let's check in. How are you today?
I'm doing fabulous, Kong, and it's a delight to be with you today. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for...
I almost feel like asking, you want a cup of coffee or something?
Well, if this was in person, we would, and I would definitely buy you a cup of coffee or your favorite beverage. I obviously have a passion for diversity, equity, inclusion, and considering you're in the space, I'm just so excited about what we'll be discussing about. I want to ask you, what's your take on the current DEI landscape as it stands in America?
Well, I think I mentioned to you before when we had coffee that I'm a little concerned about the field. And the reason is something I call excess complexity. Anyone who's outside of the field of diversity and inclusion is really confused about what it is. And therefore, that just leaves room for a lot of people with agendas other than what you and I are concerned about to put their issue underneath the banner of diversity and inclusion. One of the things that I'm suggesting to people is your issue is not wrong. I'm not against your issue, but I think it's problematic for you to put it under the banner of diversity and inclusion if it's really not diversity and inclusion. So I have been involved in D&I from the beginning. Dr. Roosevelt Thomas put it on the landscape of business. It was originally called workplace diversity. He had a brand of it called managing diversity. One of his Harvard colleagues, Dr. Jeff Howard, came along and introduced the word inclusion to the lexicon. And for probably 7 or 8 years, we were really making progress. All the leaders of the major corporations said, this is what we've been looking for. This is an issue. The workplace is changing. The makeup of the workplace is changing. We need some tools and some disciplines to help us to navigate this new field of employee and marketplace forces. And we were making progress. We came up with great training. We came up with a great context. And then people start piling on. Once they saw that it was popular and that the people with money were supporting it, that's major corporations, civil rights people, social activists, everybody piled in under the name diversity and inclusion. Now, again, I want to emphasize, I think those are worthwhile things to do. But if you're working on racial equality, let's do something radical like call it racial equality. That way, it removes the confusion about what you're working on. People are clear. If I'm supporting you, I'm supporting the idea of racial equality or gender equity or minority rights or gay and lesbian rights or the disability community. Let me be clear about what I'm supporting. But when you put it under this generic label of diversity and inclusion, and one of my colleagues says people do that just to gain instant credibility. So when you do that, you introduce excessive complexity. Complexity produces confusion. The confused mind does not act. So we've lost a lot of the momentum simply because people who would otherwise support it don't know what to do because they're confused about what it is. So that's why I'm concerned about it. And that's the reason that I wrote the new book, Diversity Training That Generates Real Change. And I'm now speaking and writing about this topic quite a bit. Just recently wrote an article in Leader to Leader journal called Who Should Lead Diversity Efforts? Not Who You Think. And it really kind of takes us very quickly back through the history that I just shared with you. And it tells that if you look at the makeup, especially in large corporations, of the Office of Diversity, there's a very suspicious look to it. They're all Black and brown skinned people, a lot of females. What you don't see there is the mix of people that really exists, which, by the way, includes able-bodied, non-Hispanic, heterosexual white men. They don't show up there. And when they don't show up there, that basically signals this is not for everybody. This is targeted for specific individuals. And what I said in an article back in 1996, if we ever approach the work without being inclusive, you can't call yourself working on inclusion when you're deliberately excluding a portion of the population. So unless we work out a way to be totally inclusive, this will never work, and we will never make the progress that we should in terms of creating the workplace, the individual, the business outcomes, and the societies that I think we all aspire to. So that's really the source of my concern, and that's what I'm speaking about nowadays. That's what the book is intended to do. That's what I'm writing about. And as an old preacher friend of mine says, I know I'm right about it.
Yeah, so a lot of great points you just shared, and I want to dive a little deeper into that. But before we go there, how did you start in this work? Like, what inspired you?
It's kind of a strange story, and I tell people all the time, I'm an anomaly in the diversity and inclusion field. I'm an engineer by training, a former corporate executive, P&L, business operations. I'm an MBA. My PhD is in management. So my focus has really not been down the human resources or personal development track. I have been about business enterprise performance. And so when I got into the movement, I was working on some other things. I had left the corporation and started my own consulting company, was working, doing good work in total quality management, Six Sigma, and all that good stuff, like a good engineer is supposed to. And then I I reconnected with Dr. Roosevelt Thomas and spent some time with him understanding the fundamentals of the work that he was proposing. And I got hooked on it. The one way you get hooked on something, by the way, when you're a consultant, is someone hires you to do it. I think about in the late 80s, right after I had started my consulting practice, a friend of mine called me and he said, his name was Bob. Bob said, Jim, I just got an opportunity to bid on this contract for this big insurance company up in the Northeast, and they want us to do something they're calling diversity. I said, Bob, what is that? He said, we'll figure it out, because he's an experienced management consultant. So long story short, we bid on it. We got the deal. 2 weeks into the deal, Bob calls me up and says, Jim, this really feels more like you than me. So you got it. So here I was, dumped into the middle of this huge project with this title, diversity, and I had to figure out, what am I going to do with this? But fortunately, to me, it was a enterprise performance issue. So basically, with this insurance company, with their field salespeople, I talk to them about leaving money on the table. Who is it that you're not selling to because you've gotten conditioned to believe they're not a target audience? Who is it that you're not serving because somehow you've been conditioned to think that that's not going to be a successful proposition? Immediately after that, about 1 year, 2 years after I started that project, I got a call from a public utility in Birmingham, Alabama. I got a call from one up in Rochester, New York. Somehow the word spread, and I'll tell you, Kong, I've never done any traditional marketing, but the word just spread, and before you know it, I had built a consulting practice around this whole idea of D&I. And so I figured I better know what I'm doing. So I spent about 1.5 years just developing my own voice in the space, but it's primarily based on the work of Dr. Roosevelt Thomas, who we lost, unfortunately, several years ago. And he is the father of this movement. And I tell people all the time when I'm speaking, so they ask, why do you talk about Roosevelt so much? I said, not because he was my friend and my mentor, but because he was right. He was right.
Mhm.
And the more I look at his work, his writings, and the things that he talked about, I am more convinced than ever that he had the right formula to get us all on the same track, not us versus them, but all of us as human beings on the same track to produce businesses and societies that would benefit us all.
What do you say to people who say, well, I don't think like you do
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion?
I said, I'm a Southerner, Kong, so you have to excuse this. I say, well, bless your heart. What you're doing, like I said, I support what you're doing. Don't call it diversity and inclusion. That creates confusion. So if you are advocating for things that are related to a specific dimension of diversity, right now I have a lot of gay and lesbian friends, and they'd say, I don't want to give up that, including that under this banner of diversity and inclusion, because people will lose sight of it if we don't. So no, they're not. Your cause is right. Call it gay and lesbian issues. Call it rights. Tell people this is what I want. I want full representation and full freedom in the society that we live in. Work on that. You'll get an audience and you'll make progress. If you call it diversity and inclusion, you've introduced a level of confusion that now even diminishes your work. It certainly diminishes the work that I'm doing, but it diminishes your work also and slows it down. Simply because we are not crisp in our language. We are not precise in what we tell people we're working on and why it makes sense. So when we get to it later on in this conversation, I'll tell you where I've arrived on D&I and why it's starting to resonate with some people, because it's simple, crisp, straightforward, and logical. And the engineer in me really that works for me.
Right. Yeah.
And
Well,
the other thing, if I may, the other thing is, I think it's important for people to understand that historic wrongs don't equal current wrongs. So from a political standpoint, and I try to stay out of the political dialogue, but I do see an opportunity here for us to create a better political climate if we were to approach it from the standpoint of we are all in this together. We are all in this together. There is no us versus them. There's only us. Us includes all of us. And I want to embrace everyone's cause, and I want to hear everyone's story. That's one of the things that we talked about in the book, is that we want to hear everyone's story. The minute we tell white men, you got to listen to us because it's been so hard for us. And then they say, well, yeah, let me tell you about my story. You don't have a story. And we shut them down. That is the end of the movement. We have got to be open to say, please listen to me. I've got some pain. And then my white brothers will say, I hear you. I feel you. And now let me tell you about my pain. Because as human beings, Kong, every human being has some stuff in their life. No
right.
matter how privileged they may look. That's one of the latest articles that I've written, is the myth of privilege, that we all have pain. My co-author calls it the meritocracy of pain.
Mhm.
Everybody has some stuff in their life, and we have to be honest enough to say, let me hear your story, and I want you to hear my story. Now let us work together so both of us have less suffering. That's a Buddhist concept, is that we're not only to release our own suffering, but we are to participate in lowering the suffering of others. So we
Mhm.
can only do that if we are willing to hear everybody.
Right. Well, that's first of all, that's very important. And one of the reasons why I decided to launch this podcast is because I want us to see our shared humanity. Now, the challenge with that is that not everybody will have the ability to empathize or have compassion. How do you work with individuals that don't have those abilities? Whereas they have always seen it as a world of us versus them. And that's how they see the world. There's no way to change them.
Well, I'm not 100% with you on that premise, because I've worked with in the classroom. Well, I've worked in the classroom with over 200,000 people personally, as well as running projects where we've done thousands and thousands more. And I've never run into a person who, given the right situation, the right tools, and the right environment, is not willing to move. So people, human beings, we are incentive-driven creatures. So if you provide the right incentive for people, they will back up, rethink what they're currently thinking, and say, how can this other way work better for me? Remember, you got to provide them with a personal motive for wanting to change. I'm an executive coach. Executive coach is all about behavior change. So the
Mhm.
technology, getting people to change their thinking and their habits, is just part of what I do on a day-to-day basis.
Mhm.
So I would say there are some people who are locked in. And one thing I tell teachers, when a child is acting out, they're always acting out for a reason. Don't just punish the behavior, find out what the reason is. When our fellow citizens act out by saying, I'm right, and no matter what you say, I know I'm right, and I'm just sticking with my position, they're acting out for a reason. Something is hurting in their life. Rather than, I tell people all the time, when you see that, don't denigrate, educate.
Mhm.
And by educating, I mean invite them through a facilitative process, invite them to rethink where they are, because it's hurting them more than it's hurting you.
Mhm.
Because, I have an option. When I have an obstinate person, I have an option. I
Mhm.
don't have to be around them. Not just as my friend Les Brown used to say, I just release you to your highest good and move on with my life. But if I love you and care about you, I will spend some time and at least invite you. And if you don't accept the invitation and you choose not to change your habits and your behaviors, I've done my job.
Mhm. What incentives? First of all, I enjoy all of Les Brown's motivational
Yeah,
speeches. If there's a way that you could help me make that connection to get him on my podcast, that's what I'd love that. I'd really appreciate it.
I will make a note of that. That's let's be old
Thank you.
friends.
I
Yeah,
appreciate it. Incredible guy. I love all of his content.
yeah,
So going back to the incentives, what incentives do you think will drive behavior change? What are some of those common ones?
yeah. The only incentive that drives human beings is what's in it for me. Okay, so we can say that's selfish. Well, of course it's selfish, but I'm just as selfish as the next guy. If I didn't see benefit to myself and my family and people like me, I wouldn't be pushing this. But I see the advantage of it. I see that this work is about not us versus them, but the human to human connections. If we get to the point where we can see other human beings as first human and then some other, if you will, rather than seeing them immediately as some other and therefore being automatically, based on our old brain conditioning, automatically resisting and rejecting them. If we can get past that and see them as human and possibly someone that I need in my life, and then once we establish a relationship, those differences don't matter so much. And in fact, those differences become a source of interest rather than a barrier to relationship. So that's what I'm pushing is this idea, let's start with our collective humanness. And we define diversity, just a simple definition, going back to the simple again. It is the collective mix of differences and similarities. I'm changing that now. It's the collective mix of similarities and differences. For the last 30 years, we've been putting the differences out front, and we focus on the differences, and everybody's talking about their differences, and you need to understand my differences and all of that. When we start with similarities, and I've got some great stories in the book about this, if we start with similarities, let me seek first to find out what we have in common. And if I do that, and once I have found that connection that we have in common, there's not many differences that are going to show up that's going to break this relationship, because now we have a kinship. We have a reason to want to connect with each other. We have a reason to want to produce with each other.
Mhm.
And so it's really just a mental shift that we have to go through. And there's a lot of brain theory that supports what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And personally, I've tried it so many times that I know it works.
Mhm. Can you share with us some of those brain theories or like neural connections that we have and how that affects the way how we think about diversity and inclusion?
See, we were blessed with this thing up here, this frontal lobe of our brain. The older version of ourselves didn't have that. They had this old brain back here, and it was just like any animal's brain. It was fight or flight, survive, and thrive. So when a caveman saw a saber-toothed tiger, he was equipped. Not one of my tribe, doesn't look like my people. I got to flee. And he looks dangerous, so I'm gone. Well, over the years, we found out by coming together as communities, all people don't represent a threat to us. And we have to be smart enough to figure out that not all people represent a threat to us. So that threat reaction, that whole brain reaction can be dampened. By the way, it's very fast. This is kind of slow. We have to override it with thinking, with logic, with reason. And we have to take what I call a 3-second pause anytime that we're in the midst of making these decisions. Take a 3-second pause and ask myself, oh my God, what is my old brain telling me? Why am I thinking that? If I follow on that, what's going to happen? Is that really what I want to happen? No. Let me override it. Hi, how you doing? My name is Dr. Rodgers. My name is Jim. Good to meet you. Tell me about yourself. Who you from? And it's an old New Orleans phrase we have, who your mama and them? Tell me about your people. Those things that we're seeking out is willing to try to, what do we ask enough until we find out what do we have in common? And I do this all the time. And I was given the example recently of President Obama and Bruce Springsteen, who are now real buds. And the reason they're buds is because in an early conversation that they were having, one of them asked the other one, why do you work so hard to be a great musician? Why do you work so hard to be a great politician? And they both concluded, I wanted to show my father that I could be successful. So now they've got that father bond, and now there is nothing that could separate him, even though he's a blue-collar kid from New Jersey, and he is one of the most elite scholars and politicians that this country has ever produced, Harvard trained, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing that says that they should automatically come together. But because they found that common connection, there's no differences that will come up that will separate the friendship now. That's the technology. As an engineer, I think of things as technology. That's the technology that we need to infuse into this conversation so that everybody has an opportunity to win with it. The incentive is, I want to win. I want people in my life and in my business and on my team that will help me win. And so that's the incentive. And if we can get people past this natural reaction to, they're not one of me, therefore I'd have to be cautious or resist or reject, then we win more. because we have the right people with the right tools and the right temperament and the right perspectives in our lives and on our team so that we get better outcomes.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, in alignment with you with regards to how we tackle challenges is our greatest solutions is dependent on whether we choose to work together or work as different teams. And
Mhm.
I've had my you know own experiences working with a variety of teams, and the ones that I you know feel I thrive with are the great ones, the ones that where everyone's collaborating, bouncing up ideas. There's psychological safety. People, they trust one another and they want to help each other succeed. Their wins are just as important as ours. And so um earlier you mentioned about well, first of all, you have this term diversity management, which to me feels like it's a different way of saying diversity, equity, inclusion. Does that encompass inclusion and belonging?
It includes diversity and inclusion. But see, if you look at the definition of diversity and inclusion,
Mm-hmm.
all these other acronyms or syllables that we're adding on have already been included. So the fact that someone can say, I'm working on DEIAB, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
it introduces further excessive complexity.
Mm-hmm.
So the definition of inclusion includes belonging. Inclusion is developing a sense of belonging for everyone on the team.
Mm-hmm.
Practice of diversity management includes equity. In other words, treat people fairly. You
Mm-hmm.
don't treat people fairly by treating them the same. You treat them fairly by treating them with equity. In other words, giving you what you need, giving Susie what she needs, giving Bob what he needs. That's
Mm-hmm.
good management. That's just plain old good management theory.
Mm-hmm.
So those things are already included. When you understand the concepts of diversity and inclusion, those things come with it. But
Mm-hmm.
if you just look at the words and say, I'm going to make that word mean this, or I'm going to make it mean that, then those additional labels become necessary because you want to make sure they're included. Well, they're already included.
Mm-hmm.
And to add those additional letters to it really just produces more complexity. So I'm not a big fan of that. And even though my book uses the word DEI over and over and over again, I've told the publishers and I told my co-author, I think we're contributing to the problem when we do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, with you know, the average American or person is just filled with a lot of just information left to right. And so if we could find ways to simplify the process and definitions as much as we can while making sense of it would really help um, people that are just beginning to think about, these types of issues.
Yeah.
And then of course, more importantly, meeting them where they are and coaching them through the process.
Yeah.
So of course, with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, and one of the Supreme Court justices having a desire to overturn gay marriage, as well as talks about doing away with affirmative action. I know you mentioned earlier you don't want to get political, but obviously we're not in I'm not your client and you're not working, but you're in a podcast. So what's your take on all of that? Obviously these are important issues for voters as we're heading towards the elections. Yeah.
So do I have thoughts about it? I do. One of my best friends is a lawyer, so when Roe was knocked down, I immediately called him and I said, Sam, tell me from a legal practitioner standpoint, what does this mean? Because I'm looking at it as an average American, and I'm thinking it just means that we reignite the conversation at the state level and get some good laws on the book. See, Roe is a legal opinion. It's not even law. See, just like affirmative action, a lot of people think affirmative action is law. It's not. It's an executive order. It's an executive opinion. It is not law. And if we ever wanted the principles of affirmative action to be installed into our system for keeps, it needs to be codified in terms of legislation. Same thing is true of the right of a woman to control her own. Now, I get a little disturbed with people leading with feelings. I know how people feel about this. But Mark Twain said one time, he says, we all do no end to feeling, and we mistake it for thinking. I'm encouraging people, back away, think. What can we do? What is the problem? What is the impact of the problem? Is that something that we can live with? If not, what's the solution? I'm an engineer, so I'm all about moving to solutions quickly. Move to solutions quickly. So right now on Roe, for instance, nobody advocates abortion. That's the problem that we have. We talk at each other that somehow people saying you are for abortion, even at 40 weeks. Nobody wants abortion. But you know something, as a man, I don't get a vote on that. It ain't my body. And I'd like for there to be a situation, as conservatives are always talking about, get the government out of my life. Well, get the government out of your bedroom. Get the government out of your, out of all these other things that you seem to want to put constrictions on. And if we do that, if we stop and think long enough, we'll figure out there is a way to do this that is lasting, sustainable, equitable, and useful.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as we're screaming at each other out of our feelings, we're not going to make progress. We're just going to demonize the other, the other. Goes back to the same principles I'm talking about. If there's an us versus them, they are the other and they're wrong and we're right. Instead of problem solving, which means come, let us reason together. How can we all be right in a way that serves the majority of us? The third solution, as Stephen Covey used to talk about.
Win-win, right?
Win-win-win. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely I used to work at Franklin Covey for a time, and so I know that that solution quite well.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on the power of mentorship? You mentioned earlier about mentoring.
Well, I happen to be working with a executive academy currently that's in which each year I use about 30 mid-level executives who are looking to see whether or not they want to join the C-suite cadre, and I'm teaching them what it takes to get there. The number one thing, relationships. The number one tool, mentorship. If you don't have a mentor, you're not serious. Well, how do I get a mentor? You ask. Simple.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about the human spirit. If someone basically says to you, I respect you enough to ask you to be my mentor, man, it's hard to turn that down.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a testament to it. I did some interviews last couple of years, and out of it, some young man from out in Utah says, Dr. Rodgers, I need some mentoring. And I said, God, I don't really have time for this. But he says, and I just got so much respect for what we talked about. I was wondering if you take some time with me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've been working together for 3 months now.
Wow, that's
I
incredible.
can't resist. So what I'm telling people is mentorship is critical. No one makes it on their own. No one knows everything. If
Mm-hmm.
you're inside an organization, you need someone to help you figure out the culture of the organization. That is what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. And you need to understand, how do you get to where you want to go?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to spread your name when you're not in the room?
Mm-hmm.
And in the process of doing that, you're going to pick up some sponsors. You're going to say, someone says, that kid looks good. I think I want to put my name behind him when it comes to upward mobility.
Mm-hmm.
These are simple, logical human traits. And we make career management so hard simply because, again, we feel rather than think. When you think about it, this is the way to progress in any organization and in any society.
Mhm. Yeah, that's incredible.
Mhm.
I certainly have my fair share of incredible mentors throughout my career, professional life, and they've been immensely useful for me, and I don't regret any of them at all. They're
Yeah.
fundamental in the direction in which I go about, my studies and my career trajectory, and I think it's very important that everybody should have a coach as well. And I think
Absolutely.
that, I think everyone could benefit from a personal coach. There's always areas of improvement in our lives, either in our financial lives or relationships or our health. And you know, the goal of a coach in any of those areas is to really help you be in the best version of yourself. And that's what this show is really about, is how can we encourage these types of conversations on a daily basis to get people to a place where they're better off.
Yeah.
And you know this show speaks to people that have a passion for self-development and want to do good in the community and make an impact. And speaking of impact, what's your impact in this world?
Well, clarity. One of the things that I say about leadership, and if you're going to be a leader, even a thought leader, one of the things that you have to work diligently towards is clarity and vulnerability. So, one of the things that I want to do is to bring clarity to all of this mess around diversity and inclusion so that everybody sees it the same way, so that we have a mass movement of everybody working on the same thing, seeing the possibilities the same way, so that there will be more support and less resistance. The problem with now is that 40% of the country and 40% of the world is gung ho for diversity and inclusion. But there's another 40% that's resisting it with all their might because they don't see what's in it for them. And they think that they're being made the enemy for something that they didn't personally do. And that's just not a recipe for success. I'm an OD consultant for many, many years. And I tell you, there are just some logical things that you have to have in place in order for a movement to be successful.
Mhm.
And when you have as much resistance as you have support, not a good, not a good plan.
Mhm.
So what I have tried to do with my latest work in terms of purpose is to celebrate the goodness of diversity and reduce the stigma of diversity. Diversity is not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, I just spoke to a group of coaches a couple of weeks ago. And my conclusion in that is that we need to approach diversity from a place of joy.
Mhm.
Joy, the process, the possibilities that we collectively can really come together and just be people and support each other and love each other and all of those things, which, I don't know many human beings, no matter how jilted they are, that would say, I don't want none of that. Yeah, of course you do. It's built into your system to want that. That's who we are as human beings. So what we have to do is invite people to a different way of approaching some of the challenges of life.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. It's beautiful. And of course, when you work from a place of joy, that inspires a great deal of people wanting to join the platform because,
Yeah.
right, like unless the person's negative person overall and just doesn't see how joy can serve them. But I don't meet
Mm,
people like that, and if I do, I kind of stay away from that. So
absolutely. Absolutely. We all have choices about who we surround ourselves and who allow into our lives. And
Mhm.
what we can do is be about the business of inviting people to a change in behavior and attitude. And if it's just a friend of mine said, you don't beat against a brick wall too long. You give it a couple good licks and say, this is a brick wall. Bye.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll circle around in another year or so and try again. Take a couple of another whacks at it. But if it's not moving, bye.
right.
Next. Hmm.
Yeah, I the one thing that I just keep going back at in my mind as you're talking about inviting people into a room and welcoming them and finding ways to meet them where they are is that people want to be heard and people want to be seen, even people that are against your movement.
Yeah.
And it's so important to include them because if we're talking about inclusion, but yet we're separating certain individuals from our movement, what does that really say about the movement that we're trying to create or the type of leader that we are? And so I, worked with a lot of DEI practitioners as colleagues and also, as clients. And, the one thing that bond all of us together is our shared humanity, share for a better world, share to to be better, um, improve our living situations,
Yeah.
and finding ways to achieve the most success for ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, and so, speaking of success, what's your definition of it?
Success is to me is not a destination, it's a journey. It is the process of doing something worthwhile every day. I'm successful because I get up every morning and I have the privilege of being just me.
Mhm.
Being me is not a skill. I told someone the other day, I'm not a great executive coach because I'm certified by company X or company Y. I'm a great executive coach because that's who I am. I've always been a coach, even when I didn't know what the word was. I've always wanted to help other people to be the best version of themselves, to achieve even more than they could expect or believe that they could do, simply because I saw something in them that they don't see in themselves. And I'm willing to spend the time to remind them this is why you're good. This
Mhm.
is what you're good at. Do more of that. Do less of this. Work to your strengths. Don't worry about your weaknesses. Find someone to fill in those blanks. So to me, success is just living a life that's doing what you were made to do. Now, I say this all the time. Your journey in life, your motivation for living early on is to find out why you're here. What you were you put here to do. And when you find that thing, that one thing, do it. And you'll never work another day in your life. And that's really what drives me, and that's how I define myself as successful. And that's what I'm inviting other people to do. So I love what you're doing, Kong, is that I know a little bit about your background. I know that you left some of the corporate stuff like I did, and you saw a purpose. You're getting close to understanding this is why I was put here. I'm uniquely capable of having conversations like this with people and bringing clarity around those things. So I want to congratulate you and stay on track because I will guarantee you'll do quite well doing so.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that observation. And I think you hit on that note quite well with people finding what their impact is and what drives them, their motivation and their purpose in life. And I just want to acknowledge your presence and also appreciate your work because it's so important for so many people and corporations trying to drive change, throughout their organization and impacting communities in ways that would have a positive return on their contribution. And so this work is important, it's needed more than ever. And I know there's a lot of people looking for guidance and expertise from very knowledgeable and experienced practitioners, diversity management practitioners such as yourself. So I want to acknowledge your work and thank you for all that you do to ensure that we create a world of equality, fairness, justice, and for people to live how they choose to live in a way that is with respect and dignity and with equal treatment. And I know we're just about to wrap up here. What departing advice would you give to my listeners listening to this show?
As it relates to diversity and inclusion is a relationship discipline. And the reason I've reduced it down to that, because that is the highest level of goals that we can set forth, that all people are not distracted by differences in terms of the relationships that they have in their life. There's an old wisdom saying that says, seek ye first the highest goal, and all these subordinate goals will be added to it. That was a great teacher, the Nazarene, who said that. And as I practice that, if we shoot for this being a relationship discipline, race, gender, ethnicity, disabilities, ageism, all of that comes along with it. If I shoot for those things, as we've proven over the last 30 years, I'm not going to get any of that, nor will I get the relationship discipline. So shoot for the highest goal, and the rest of it will follow. You'll get all of it. So I would just invite people to rethink, not refeel, rethink what they're doing in the area of diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. That's well said. Thank you so much, James. And where can people find you should they choose to connect with you after listening to this show?
I'm on LinkedIn, but also jamesorogers.com. That's Rogers with a D, jamesorogers.com. Will give you everything you need to know about how I'm working nowadays, the media, including my books, my speaking engagements, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the things that I would invite you to take a look at. And Kong, I just want to say it's been delightful talking to you.
Thank you. And likewise here as well. Thank you so much for contributing your knowledge and wisdom on my show, providing all of my listeners, the valuable information that they'll need to take with them to think about how they want to make a greater impact in the communities that they're part of, as well as their loved ones and friends. And folks, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast episode, please, I encourage you to connect with James and also let him know where you found him, which is through the Purpose Tune podcast. I hope that you'll also like this episode as well as share it widely within your network. And James, thank you again. There are the books for you folks to take a look at the titles, and I encourage you all to get a copy of it. And until then, James, it's been wonderful connecting with you today. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Be blessed.